Swadika, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen who are watching our program from home via YouTube in Thailand, Japan, and other parts of the world. My name is Rungtip Chonapalai. I will be moderating the symposium today. Today is our great pleasure and honor to welcome everyone to our International Public Symposium on Culture and Diplomacy number 2, reviewing role of public institutes and culture exchanges. The purpose of this symposium is to follow up with the past achievements of our series on culture and diplomacy number 1 in December 2020, and to review what are the vision and policies that the Japan Foundation, or JF, as public institute, and the government of Japan have been implementing in international cultural exchange towards Asia over half of the century, and to discuss the roles that international cultural exchange can play and the changes in the environment surrounding it. Before we will proceed to the program today, let me explain all of you how to interact and ask for questions and answers and sharing your comments to us, since we are now conducting the program by live streaming online via YouTube program for those who watch the event at home due to the strict restrictions of physical gathering. The program will be divided into 2 parts, with keynote address on the Japan Foundation's approach to Asia, half a century, history and challenges, and panel discussions on review role of international cultural exchanges by Japanese and Thai scholars, as well as a practitioner from private sector. Moreover, for those who are watching the program online from home, please write down into our chat box of our YouTube program. We will pick up those questions and ask the presenters. Significantly, we created a questionnaire form and posted into YouTube program descriptions. We will highly appreciate if those who watch the program online from YouTube kindly share your comments for our improvement later. So now it's time to start our program with the keynote address on the Japan Foundation's approach to Asia, half a century history and challenges. We are very much honored and most grateful and delighted to have Professor Dr. Ogawa Tadashi from the Faculty of Letters at Tomi University in Japan to stay with us today. You can refer to the slides in Japanese in the link embedded in the description space of YouTube. So now, please welcome our keynote speaker, Professor Dr. Ogawa Tadashi.
お願いいたします。Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Tadashi Ogawa from Atomic University. Runtip-san, thank you so much. Professor Kitty, Mr. Gantatorn, as well as the Japan Foundation at the Bangkok office. Thank you so much for this opportunity, and nice to meet you, everyone who is tuning in. My name is Ogawa. Today, I would like to talk under the theme, the Japan Foundation's approach to Asia, half a century history and challenges. This is today's presentation theme and outline. I will look back on the half-century history of the Japan Foundation's exchanges, strategies, and policies towards Asia, and consider changes in the environment surrounding international cultural exchanges and its potential role in the international cultural exchange. There are 3 main points. First is the Japan Foundation's approach to Asia, its origin and development. Historical view is the first theme. Second is the changes surrounding Japan's cultural exchanges in Asia. The third is challenges and potentialities of Japan's cultural exchanges in Asia. First, Let's take a look at the evolution of the Japan Foundation's exchanges in Asia in the past 50 years. On this table, you see the data on number of people learning Japanese language outside of Japan. In 1979, shortly after the Japan Foundation was founded, only 120,000 people were learning Japanese around the world. However, according to the survey taken in 2018, there were 3.85 million people learning Japanese language. Many Japanese language learners are people from Asia. What this means is that in the past half century, many people in Asia started taking interest towards Japan and started to think that they want to interact with the Japanese culture through learning Japanese. Let's take a look at how the Japan Foundation's exchanges in Asia have evolved in the past 50 years using this table. This shows Japan Foundation's operational policies and strategies decade by decade, its characteristics and main projects. In 1972, the Japan Foundation was established. In 1970s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, 2010s, and then now. We can point to some characteristics during these periods. First, the characteristic of 1970s. Back then, in Southeast Asia, there were definitely anti-Japanese sentiments. The Japan Foundation was tasked with tackling that. The offices in Jakarta and Bangkok were established back in 1974. In 1974, a huge incident occurred. Then Prime Minister of Japan, Mr. Kakue Tanaka, visited Southeast Asian countries including Thailand, Indonesia, and Malaysia, which caused a huge anti-Japan protest. In Jakarta, a riot occurred. The Japanese people then were stunned to see this. A reflection on how best to interact and have relationship with Asian countries was made. With that in mind, Prime Minister Takeo Fukuda announced Fukuda Doctrine in 1978, which was a diplomatic policy. It consisted of 3 pillars. Japan does not aim to become military superpower. Japan will consolidate the relationship of mutual trust with ASEAN based on heart-to-heart interactions. And Japan and ASEAN are equal partners. Fukuda Doctrine played an important role in determining the directionality of the Japan Foundation's projects in Asia. Fukuda Doctrine was born from the response to anti-Japan sentiments. With the doctrine at the basis, the Japan Foundation in the 1980s conducted some unique projects which characterized Japan. First is a project to introduce Southeast Asian culture to Japan. In the 1970s, one of the reasons why the Southeast Asian countries criticized Japan was because they were alarmed that Japan may be invading their countries not only on the economic side, but also through culture. They were afraid of cultural imperialism. In order to show that their concerns were unfounded, Japan tried to promote bilateral exchanges rather than conducting unilateral introduction of Japan. It tried to show that Japan is there to support cultural development of Asia. From that perspective, Southeast Asia culture was introduced to the Japanese people, which meant to show that Japan respects their cultures. In addition, this project respected diversity of cultures in Southeast Asia, as well as South Asia, and preserving and recording of those cultures were made at the same time. I joined the Japan Foundation in 1982. In that year, South Asian Festival, which screened Southeastern and South Asian movies, was held. This was the first featured film festival that showed the Japanese people that there are exceptional film arts in Southeast Asia. Since then, Asian movies started drawing attention of the Japanese people. In that sense, this festival was a historical event. The poster on the slide here is an Indonesian film, Penjamis dan Tukang Becak, starring one of the most famous actresses there, Christine Hakim. I was very moved by this movie, and I started thinking I wanted to be involved in cultural exchanges in a country like Indonesia, where great movies are being produced. That dream came true when I was assigned to Indonesia. In addition, a program called ATPA was being conducted. Every 3 years, cultural exchanges on intangible traditional art in Asia was conducted. This program recognized that traditional music, dance, and rituals were disappearing or changing in the face of modernization in Southeast and South Asia. The program intended to store and record these cultures before it completely disappeared. This program had a mid to long-term perspective and was not intended to be a single-year event. It aimed to preserve a traditional culture. At the beginning of 1980s, Cultural Revolution in China was ended. 4 modernization initiatives began. Through Japanese language education and studies on Japan, Japan collaborated in the Chinese initiative. A training center named after the prime minister who proposed this initiative, Ohira School, was built as a center to retrain Japanese language teachers in China in a centralized manner. In the 1990s, the unique Asia projects conducted by Japan Society, starting from Japan Foundation from the 1970s, were enhanced even further, both qualitatively and quantitatively. One of them is Japan Foundation ASEAN Culture Center, which was established in 1990 in Tokyo. This was a project to enable Japanese people to know more about ASEAN's culture and art, especially modern culture. Introduction of performing arts, movies, and art from Southeast Asia were to be introduced to Japan. In the center, visitors get to read various magazines and newspapers from Southeast Asia. This was the first time such venue was physically created in Japan. That was in 1990. 5 years after that, Japan Foundation Asia Center was established, expanding the scope of cultural introduction from just ASEAN to Asia overall. The goal for the center was not only about Japan understanding more about Southeast Asia. It went beyond that aim for mutual understanding amongst Asian countries about each other. For example, Thailand knowing more about the Philippines about Indonesia, Indonesia about India. This was to promote the mutual understanding amongst the countries within the Asia region and strengthen their network. Based on the mutual understanding built through this initiative, mindset was to be nurtured of Asian community. That was the goal of the Japan Foundation Asia Center. The organization completed its work in 10 years. Department holding the name of Asia Center disappeared from Japan Foundation at the time. However, in 2014, an organization named Asia Center was once again established. I would like to call the one established in 1995 as the first Asia Center, and the one that was established in 2014, the second Asia Center. The first Asia Center focused on promoting comprehensive understanding of the Asia region, as well as to collaborate on the preservation of Asian culture and introducing Asian culture and art to Japan. These were the three pillars. Rather than just sending out information about Japan, the center tried to contribute to the promotion of comprehensive understanding of Asia or providing support in developing talents and cultural field in Asia. This objective was independent of Japanese national interest and was one of the characteristics of the cultural exchanges in the 1990s.
Now, in the 2000s, one of the characteristics of cultural exchange was that new theories of cultural exchange, such as public diplomacy and soft power, were being discussed around the world, including Asia. There was a heightening interest in these new theories of cultural exchange. Also, in terms of Japan's stance toward Asia, there was a shift in focus. Japan's focus shifted during the 2000s from Southeast Asia to East Asia, namely South Korea and China. In 2002, Japan and South Korea jointly hosted the Soccer World Cup, and the governments of the two countries launched a year-long program to promote citizens' exchanges as the Year of Japan ROK National Exchange. At this time, the relationship between Japan and South Korea improved considerably. On the other hand, in China, there were large anti-Japanese demonstrations in Beijing and Shanghai over Prime Minister Koizumi's visits to the Yasukuni Shrine. Under this backdrop, the Japan Foundation China Center was established in 2006 with the aim of strengthening the exchanges between the youth and citizens of Japan and China. As for the 2010s, the Great East Japan Earthquake occurred in 2011, and this had a major impact on Japan's diplomacy and cultural exchange. The earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear power plant accident were a triple catastrophe never before experienced by mankind. In the midst of misunderstandings and false rumors based on inaccurate information, such as Japan may never recover, or Japan's agricultural products are unsafe due to radioactive contamination, the Japan Foundation tried to disseminate accurate, truthful information showing the world the real Japan and that Japan has the will to revive again by implementing projects related to the Great East Japan Earthquake. The Japan Foundation promoted various projects, seizing the opportunities brought about by the earthquake to deepen the bonds and a sense of camaraderie between Japan and the rest of the world. First of all, projects related to disaster prevention to convey Japan's experiences and lessons learned from the disaster in the hope that they will be useful for future disaster prevention of the international community. In addition, through cultural exchange with the rest of the world, projects were implemented to help Japan recover its vitality. This was the first half of the 2000s. And then in the latter half of the 2000s, the Abe administration launched the policy of strategic communication, and Japan House became one of the concrete projects. The Japan Foundation also became involved in this trend by relocating its overseas offices to Japan House. Having quickly reviewed the history of the Japan Foundation for each decade over the past 50 years, I will now pick up some characteristics of the changes over the past 50 years from the perspective of Japan's cultural diplomacy with Asia. First, Asia's remarkable economic growth and social transformation. Second, impact of globalization. Third, new theories on international cultural exchange. And four, the introduction of neoliberalistic management to cultural exchange. The world is undergoing major changes, and some people opine that there is a power shift from the West to Asia. For example, in 2009, comparing the GDP of the G7 and the E7, E7 are the emerging economies such as China, India, Brazil, Russia, Indonesia, and Mexico, G7 was slightly larger than that of E7 in 2009. However, by 2050, the E7 will surpass the G7, according to some economic experts. Economic development in Asia has created a huge middle class in each country's society. For example, in terms of the percentage of the middle class households in major Asian countries, in 2016, the total number of middle class households or above in China was 360 million or 80%, 150 million or 56% in India, and 94 million households or 63% in the 6 Asian countries combined. So the middle class play a central role in each country's society. In ASEAN, the number of middle class people has increased by 2.4 times in the past 10 years. It is these middle class people who are becoming the central players of cultural exchange. Rather than a handful of wealthy elites and intellectuals taking the lead, ordinary citizens and young students are now the main bearers of cultural exchange, promoting diversification of the people who participate in cultural exchange. Today, Asia being poor is a thing of the past. The photo on the left shows Singapore before World War II, but this image of Asia has been completely replaced by the image of a glittering, dynamically growing Asia. The sense of we have to assist poor Asia creates a hierarchical relationship between those who help and those who are helped. However, when it comes to cultural exchanges with societies that are both affluent and where the middle class is in charge of the exchanges, there is no hierarchical relationship and a sense of equal partnership is nurtured and shared. The second change in Asia that I would like to mention is the impact of globalization. This includes aspects such as expanding the base of empathy, unification of culture, and localization. As globalization progressed since the 1990s, it has often been understood that globalization is actually a penetration of American culture. In fact, as seen in this photo, McDonald's chain was born in the US, but can be found in India or Thailand or Japan and have become a familiar sight in each country. In the common experience of eating the same kind of food and receiving the same kind of service, empathy for those who have the same experience spreads. So this is an aspect of expanding the foundation of empathy. However, some people fear that Americanization will take over the globe and the whole world will be covered by a monotonous, uniform culture. But actually, the reality is that in India, McDonald's do not serve beef. It is an Indian-style Mac that uses other meats for the patty. And in Japan, McDonald's has a teriyaki-flavored samurai McDonald's burger that uses soy sauce seasoning. Thailand also has its own McDonald's with Thai characteristics. It has now become apparent that globalization does not just make cultures uniform, but also involves a complex aspect of localization. The power shift is occurring not only in the economy, but also in culture. Western culture is still very influential and has a large presence in the world, but there is also a major power shift. As well as the global popularity of Japanese pop culture, China and South Korea are gaining attention as cultural powerhouses in the world. The popularity of the Korean K-pop and Hallyu Korean wave is now a given around the world, more than Japanese culture. Another exchange, although controversial, is the expansion of China's Confucius Institutes around the world to promote Chinese culture. As was the case with Japan in the past, becoming an economic superpower means that, like it or not, people are interested in exploring the source of the country's economic strength, which increases their interest in that country. Global interest in China is spreading, and the Chinese government is capitalizing on this to strengthen its influence. This is another example of globalization, which is not limited to Americanization.
One of the things that has brought globalization is the rapid development of telecommunications technologies after the 1990s. Internet and social media can go beyond borders in a second. This was a media revolution. This is expanding the potential of cultural exchanges in a new way. So this symposium is also that example. For example, Japan Foundation sets up a discussion forum online that connects researchers on Japan from various parts of the world. When I was a director at Japan Foundation, I organized World Forum of Japanese Studies Scholars. The logistics portion of the forum was very cumbersome. However, now we can use the internet and a global forum can be held much more easily. We can promote global networking, which is a positive side of this era. However, at the same time, there is a negative aspect as well. In the virtual world of internet, extremist and exclusivist view discussions are being held, or conspiracy theory, which causes narrow-minded nationalism, and it spreads around the world. One of the changes surrounding cultural exchanges included an emergence of a new theory in the field of cultural exchanges. Because of that, people pay closer attention to cultural exchanges. For example, Professor Joseph Nye from the United States talked about soft power, and his logic had greatly impacted cultural exchanges around the world. Soft power is something that goes against military or economic powers, or hard power. Through its attractiveness, soft power can move your counterpart to the direction which you want them to be. The sources of soft power include culture, value, and social systems. Along with soft power came the concept of public diplomacy. This has also greatly impacted the world after the 1990s. The past diplomacy was about negotiation between countries or governments to determine what should be done. As democracy spread around the world and public opinion started to matter more to the decisions made by the government, diplomacy started being made not only to the counterpart government, but also directly to the counterpart citizens, where the relationship is built. The methodology used included cultural exchanges, international media, or public relation on policy. Those combined are called public diplomacy. One of the three categories of this includes international cultural exchanges. When we look at the development of public diplomacy in the United States, it began in the 1960s during Cold War. It started out with promoting ideas about how superior sets of values and social system of the United States were compared to the Eastern Bloc. However, after the end of Cold War in 1989, public diplomacy initiatives were shrunk. However, once again, due to the 9/11 terrorist attacks and the fight against terrorism that followed, public diplomacy revived through the promotion of American values and democracy towards the youth in the Middle East in order to improve the sentiment towards the United States. However, this project for the Middle East did not go very well. Public diplomacy was reconsidered. Towards the end of the 2000s, the concept of new public diplomacy was born. I would like to tentatively name the public diplomacy initiatives before the new public diplomacy as Cold War type public diplomacy, where public relations on policy and sets of values were created for citizens living in the target countries. New public diplomacy, as defined by Jan Melissen, is different from the Cold War type public diplomacy on several points. Cold War type public diplomacy was led by the state. On the other hand, new public policy has various actors, including civil organizations, international institutions like the UN, as well as local governments. The Cold War type public diplomacy tended to strictly draw a line between domestic and abroad, and focused on the abroad portion. The new public diplomacy comprehensively considers domestic and abroad and tries to connect the two. So likewise, Japan Foundation's Asian projects are bilateral and comprehensively regards domestic and abroad. This means that the foundation had been implementing the new public diplomacy since the 1980s. Let me talk about the stance of Japanese diplomacy towards Cold War type public diplomacy. During World War II, culture was used as military propaganda. The government has censored culture and deprived people of their freedom. After reflecting on these past mistakes, after the war, the government took the stance that it would not intervene in cultural affairs. It also resolved that to distance diplomacy and culture so that diplomacy and politics would not be closely connected to culture. That was the characteristic of the Japanese diplomacy. The authorities considered the culture should be handled by the private sector. So that was the mainstream mindset. In 1972, the Japan Foundation was established. There was heightened understanding that international exchange has a significant role to play in diplomacy. However, until the 2010s, the stance that public relation on policy and cultural exchanges should be separated was held firmly. The Shinzo Abe administration took office in December 2012. A term that started being frequently used was strategic communication. There was a mention of this word in the Diplomacy Blue Book in 2013. In its 2014 version, there was a featured article on information provision securing territorial integrity. As I mentioned earlier, there was a strong sentiment that cultural exchanges and politics should be separated from each other after the war. In the second Abe administration, a trend became apparent. Information provision for public relations on policy and international cultural exchanges started being conducted in an integrated manner. The term strategic was considered as a political and militaristic term in the past. Due to that, it was not used in public documents related to culture. However, in the Abe administration aimed to proactively conduct public diplomacy, they started using the term strategic communication frequently in Diplomacy Blue Book. The fourth change was the introduction of neoliberal management of cultural exchange. As a part of that initiative, performance review of cultural exchanges was started being made. In the neoliberal performance review, outcome must be shown in numbers. If there is no numerical outcome, it was understood as administrative waste. It would be subject to cost cuts and discontinuation. More efficient and effective projects should be conducted instead. That is the neoliberal methodology. As a result of that, projects that cannot be evaluated in numbers or projects that cannot bear fruit within a short amount of time tended to be appraised low. For example, student exchange programs would take 30 to 40 years to truly see what kind of outcome it has brought by looking at how the exchanged student had led his or her life. However, that cannot be evaluated in the short term. This tends to bring a trend that projects which are quantifiable or that bring short-term results are more appreciated. There is a risk that the true value of cultural exchanges would be lost. From here, I would like to talk about the challenges and potentialities of the future in Japan's cultural exchanges in Asia. There are 4 points. fostering equal partnership to address common agendas, responding to global identity crisis, arm's length between culture and politics, sustainable dialogues and collaborations under COVID-19. As I have mentioned at the beginning, Japan and Asian countries should consider and discuss common agendas as equal partners. That would be very important. For example, one common issue is declining birth rate and aging society. Japan, South Korea, and Thailand are already in the age of declining birth rate and aging society. Many societal issues are becoming apparent. There is a need to work together in providing solution to how the society should look like in such an era. The countries should be working with each other.
Urged by the labor shortage caused by aging population and low birth rate, Japan has been proactively accepting foreign workers. This will lead to making Japan a more multi-ethnic society. The number of foreign people working in Japan increased from 150,000 in 1985 to nearly 3 times that in 2019, ratio-wise from less than 1.5% to 4%. Non-Japanese workers are indispensable for the aging Japanese society, and that is why Japanese people are discussing how to create an inclusive society together with the Asian people. One method of fostering mutual understanding that has been suggested by Japanese language experts is to promote Yasashi Nihongo, meaning easy Japanese, in order to make Japanese easier to learn and a more user-friendly communication tool. Now, when it comes to global environmental issues, such as natural disasters caused by the changes in the environment, which is becoming ever more severe, what kind of cultural approaches can be taken for disaster mitigation and recovery? In Japan, especially after the Great East Japan earthquake, many people have become aware of such needs. Many conflicts and frictions are occurring throughout the world today. One fundamental cause is that each society is undergoing drastic social transformations, and as a result, many individuals are left questioning who they are, with a sense of identity crisis. And this is not just for individuals, but also nations and society as a whole. They are also questioning their identity. It is amidst this identity crisis that excessive need for dignity or self-esteem, and this creates narrow-minded nationalism and populism. In his book, Identity, U.S. political scientist Francis Fukuyama writes, need for dignity has 2 aspects. The first is to be respected as an equal, and second is the desire to be recognized as superior to others. Xenophobia and religious extremism are born out of the frustration that desire to be equal is not fulfilled. Excessive nationalism, to want to be at the top, at the helm of the world, is the desire of powerful nations to be superior. Fukuyama argues that this distorted need for dignity is plunging the world into confusion. Cultural exchanges can be understood as a way to respect each other's dignity, to fulfill each other's need for dignity and self-esteem, and prevent excessive nationalism from arising. Globalization is transforming societies, and this causes identity crisis. Actually, Japan has continued to struggle with balancing its tradition and modernization ever since the Meiji Restoration. Pre-war Japan's ultra-nationalism, I believe, is the result of the collapse of the balance between tradition and modernization. This was a terrible and bitter experience, and the balance between tradition and modernization are problems that many non-Western countries, Asian countries included, have struggled with. The revival of religion that started in the late 20th century all over the world, for Islam and Buddhism too, are evidence of stronger religious awareness. Huntington wrote in The Clash of Civilizations and the Remaking of World Order that in the 21st century, friction and conflicts will be caused by difference in civilization and culture. Japan Foundation's exchange program is conducted in the belief that dialogue and networking across different religions and culture is necessary to prevent this kind of a clash of civilization. For example, Asia Center's program aims to create a network of mutual dialogue between Japanese people and young people from Southeast Asia and Muslims, whom the Japanese people do not understand well. The appropriate distance between culture and politics is an important topic for cultural exchanges. Cultural exchanges conducted as public diplomacy is situated as part of foreign policy, but if you focus on the cultural aspect, it is cultural policy as well. One important principle in cultural policy is arm's length, keeping an appropriate distance between culture and politics so that they can supplement one another. This balance becomes precarious when insular nationalism is on the rise. Some people may say it's a waste of money if it doesn't promote the country's interests. Or when someone criticizes the government's policy, he or she is deemed unpatriotic. Strategic application of cultural exchange brings the relationship between culture and politics closer. As the distance between the two become closer, the arm's length principle is shaken, and there is a possibility of the adhesion of culture and politics, or a friction between the two. Some people believe that the Japan House, which was established by the Japanese government, should not only serve as a place to disseminate Japanese culture, but also Japan's position on territorial issues and historical positions. However, when policy communication and cultural exchange are intertwined together, some people may view this as propaganda by the Japanese government and discredit the sense of affinity that they originally had towards Japanese culture. How to strike the right balance between policy promotion and cultural exchange is a very difficult challenge that each country's cultural representatives are struggling with. Finally, there is the issue of the global spread of COVID-19 that we are facing. The pandemic is blocking and inhibiting human interaction across borders. COVID-19, which interferes with people-to-people exchange, may be the deadliest enemy in the history of modern cultural exchange. An insular, inward-looking attitude has begun to take root in people's minds as we avoid interaction with foreign countries. Actually, even before COVID, there was a growing majority of Japanese youth who, unlike their predecessors, did not want to work abroad and wanted to stay in Japan because it was a comfortable place to live. In Vietnam, Thailand, and Malaysia, still, the majority of people want to work abroad, which shows a good contrast. COVID may spur this kind of an inward-looking orientation of Japanese young people even more. How can we overcome such an insular mindset and develop an outwardly open consciousness? This is now becoming important for Japan to think about when it comes to cultural exchange in the post-COVID era. And beyond that, there are many issues that Japan, Thailand, and other countries in Southeast Asia need to tackle together. How can Asia build a sense of regional community similar to that of the EU? How can we engage China as an equal partner in building this sense of regional community? And how can we enhance the network of diverse cultural dialogue amongst the various sectors of the region? We need to think about these challenges. Asia needs to redouble its efforts to learn more about each other. COVID is rocking the spirit of international collaboration all over the world. But I believe that now is the time for Asia to take the initiative in rebuilding international cooperation. So that is it from me. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Ogawa, for your valuable thoughts and interesting perspective of international cultural exchange over the past 50 years of Japan Foundation towards Asia. We are very much provoking and stimulating ideas to discussion how we should move forward for the next century and what will be changing roles of those public institutes and government of Japan to do it. So therefore, may I introduce another two speakers from academia and private sector who come to stay with us here at the studio at the Japan Foundation in Bangkok, and they will share and exchange their comments with Professor Ogawa on review role of international cultural exchanges. So the first panelist and discussant is Professor Dr. Kitti Prasarsuk from the Faculty of Political Science, Thammasat University. The second panelist and discussant is Mr. Kantathorn Wannavasu, Representative Director of Mediator Company Limited. So please welcome Professor Kitti and Mr. Kantathorn on the screen, and may I ask for both of your feedbacks to Professor Ogawa's presentation. So Professor Kitti first.
Thank you, Chair. It's my great pleasure to be in this forum, particularly to see Professor Ogawa again. I think we have seen each other the last time several years ago, and I'm very happy to be in the same session with you again. And thanks so much for your insightful account, and in fact, a very insider view of information and analysis regarding Japan and Japan Foundation in regard to cultural diplomacy. I think my reactions to your talks, I think first I will start with the point that you emphasize in your talk on globalization impact, which refer to standardization, localization, and expanding of empathy, shared feelings. And at the same time, we have seen the increasing cultural presence of China and Korea. We see the influence of ICT, information communication technology. On this, I have 4 points to discuss. First, globalization, I think in general, it refers to the diminishing role of state. The state can play less role compared to the past or pre-globalization world. But however, we can't rule out the role of states in diplomacy, in culture, and so on. It's true that the diplomacy and also cultural spread is less controllable compared to the past. Cultural consumption, cultural promotion are being done by many actors, not only the state. Non-state actor is becoming more and more important. The media, the NGO and private sector that promote a variety of pop culture. But anyhow, we can see from the case of Korea and China that state still can play a big role in promoting culture, particularly pop culture. I will come back to this point later on. That means we need to reconsider the role of the state in the globalization world. Secondly, the ICT generate new platform for cultural promotion, cultural communication, cultural diplomacy, public diplomacy. It make it easy for access for the platform. In the past, if you want to promote some movie or TV series, you need to go to traditional TV and theater, movie theater. But now streaming is become the major platform for cultural promotions. That also means more competition in the realm of culture. So my third point is the Asianization of global culture. We have seen more Asian influences, more Asian cultures in the world nowadays. Korea, China, of course. And for Korea, I think the model that Korea has in promoting its culture and cultural diplomacy is the PPP, or public-private partnership. Public-private partnership. They cooperate quite tightly, particularly after the Asian financial crisis, in order to recover the country from the financial crisis. And they have target audiences, they have strategy, they have packaging, their soft power industry, cultural industry, with also tie in tourism, tie in cosmetics, tie in food, and many things. So I think Korea is quite successful in working together between public and private spheres. For China, I think the model for China cultural promotion this day is more emphasized on platform. China create their own platform like iQIYI, so that you can stream TV series, movie, not only from China, but in Thailand, in order to watch TV series, we need to use this kind of platform, iQIYI platform. And that also a lot of Chinese movie that you can stream together, Chinese TV series. So here I mean Japan has more competitors. Japan has more competitions in terms of cultures as well as cultural diplomacy. So that means I think Japan will need to reconsider the role of the state in promoting culture. And this leads me to the fourth point. That is, from Southeast Asian perspective, we have variation. We have differences, 10 countries. We can understand it as the old ASEAN country, Thailand, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Singapore, Brunei, and new ASEAN country, CLMV, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and Vietnam. The condition, the perception are also different. So Japan has a first mover advantage in the all ASEAN country. So they know Japan very well. But for CLMV country, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Vietnam, they're all new to Japan, Korea, China, all new to them. They're like a green field that need to be cultivated in terms of culture. That means Japan does not have the first mover advantage. And in fact, country like Vietnam, a lot of investment come from Korea. In Indonesia as well, Korea investment has been increasing. That means Japan should consider tailor-made program in this country. For all ASEAN countries, they know very well about Japanese traditional culture and also pop culture. But for CLMV country, they might not know much about Japan traditional culture. So Japan will need to promote that more than in all ASEAN country, for example. So I think my conclusion on this discussion point is first, Japan has more competitor, and in terms of state role, I think Japan will need to step up the role of the state because you got more competitors in Asia and in all over the world. So Japan has a lot of good capital in terms of cultures, and in fact, social capital that can be publicized to the world, to Asia. Japan has many advantages, but Japan need to spend time, spend more resources, and has more strategy in order to engage with Southeast Asia and also East Asia. The country has different needs, different perceptions. So I look forward to hear discussion from Okawa Sensei and also from Mr. Kantathorn and Dr. Rungtip on this point. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Gitti, for your very comprehensive comments. And Mr. Kantathorn, please give your comments, towards the Professor Okawa's.
はい、ありがとうございました。
Thank you very much. I will speak in Japanese. Thank you for this opportunity. Listening to Professor Ogawa's presentation, it was very, very logical and comprehensive. Thank you very much. I am from the private sector. I am Thai, but I have been involved with Japan for many years. So I would like to add to Professor Ogawa's presentation in some aspects. First of all, Professor Ogawa talked about the relationship between culture and politics, and my comment may be more geared toward culture and the economy. So very macro, logical explanation was given by Professor Ogawa. So I would like to add some of the what aspect. Culture and diplomacy. For example, what are the contents that Thai people appreciate from Japan? Listening to Professor Kitty, I thought that it's very important to gain a deeper understanding of what are the contents that the Thai people are really interested in when it comes to Japanese culture. And I would like to elaborate on 3 points. First, general Thai people's impression of Japan, including culture and contents, is that Japan has a first mover advantage. I myself, my parents benefited from the Japanese companies that came to Thailand, and I was able to come to Japan to study foreign exchange. So the baby boomers and the Generation X have been hugely impacted by Japan. So in the past, for example, you had to buy a Sony TV if you're going to buy a TV. And movies, and everybody knows Oshin, which is the TV feature, and Okyu-san, which is a kind of a traditional Japanese anime. Everybody was familiar with that. But then when it comes to Generation Y or Generation Z, now there are more competitors out there. And the presence of Japan in Thailand may be weakening. So that is one concern that I have. So there is a generational change. And when it comes to the younger generations, there may be a lesser presence of the Japanese culture. My second point, the graph that was described by Professor Ogawa toward the beginning explained the number of people studying Japanese around the world. So only 120,000 people in 1979, but 3.8 million people or so in 2016. But if you compare this with the people who are studying Chinese or the number of people who are studying Korean, this kind of a relative comparison may be quite interesting to observe. The X generation and the Y generation as well have consumed Japanese contents, the manga, the games, various Japanese culture. So there was a strong motivation to study Japanese. And this really contributed to growing the number of Japanese learners from 120,000. However, Japanese culture prompted many people to learn Japanese, but many people also gave up. Maybe because the Japanese language is difficult to learn, but one feedback that I learned from the business sector was that Japanese language, many people want to learn a Japanese language for something fun, for anime or for traveling to Japan and eating delicious food. But when it comes to using Japanese to be successful in business, actually only opportunities in the manufacturing sector is available in Thailand. So the initial reason for studying Japanese and the kind of the business opportunities awarded by learning Japanese, there's a very large discrepancy. So people feel like this is not what I wanted or imagined for learning Japanese. And I think that this is something that could be addressed in a way to sustainably grow Japanese fans. So in terms of the culture and the economy, there needs to be a better fusion between the two. And my third point, Asian countries and globally, there are roughly 200 countries in the world. And when it comes to culture, I looked at this in different time frames. 4,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, these civilizations are basically gone and only artifacts are remaining. But Japanese food or Chinese food or Indian culture, I think that these countries with over 1,000-year history is now prevalent, including Thai. When it comes to different cuisines, Japanese food, Thai food, Korean food, Chinese food, there are different categories. And not all countries have kind of a genre cuisine. So what I would like to emphasize is that Japan has a very long history, and which era's culture does Japan want to promote? So Japan needs to focus its energy and be selective. The word culture includes various aspects like the tea ceremony or no or kabuki. These are kind of the old traditional Japanese culture. And there's also the pop culture, which it was created in less than a century. So are we going to push for example, 900 years of the past 1,000 years, or are we going to focus more on the modern Japan? And Japan needs to have a more strategic stance in being selective And when it comes to the economic impact, I believe that we need to focus more on the modern, past century culture. Japan's Olympic was successful. The word subculture and otaku may give some negative impressions, being nerdy, but when the Dragon Quest music was played in the opening ceremony, the global otakus were jubilant and really happy about that. So I think that there needs to be a government initiative. For example, Johnny's or Kadokawa, people with these private sector needs to work with the government. So not just promoting whatever seems to work, but having a more clearly defined direction. So my third point is being more concentrated and selective and focused in promoting culture. That is it from me. Thank you very much.
Both comments from the two panelists who give very interesting comments. Professor Kitty has comments particularly on the, in terms of policies and practices. And while Mr. Kandathorn from the private sectors, he raised questions how Japan should focus and be selective to promote cultures. And we have the second round. After this second round of comments, we will go to questions that you are watching us now. You can send your questions and comments to our chat box, okay? The second round will be focusing on changes surrounding Japan's cultural exchanges with Asia. As Professor Ogawa also mentioned that there are other, like big and great culture, for example, China and Korea, and also Westernization. So the question will be to Mr. Kandathorn about globalization impacts, including standardization, localization, and expanding and the foundation of empathy, increasing of cultural presence of China and Korea, including ICT as well. Yes, please.
Thank you very much for that question. So first is the assumption that we have the term globalization. We are Generation X. When we learned about the internet, we started out with dial-up line. The babies and the children nowadays know internet, Google, iPad. They have these three packaged in one from birth. So the assumption of the world that they see and the ones that we see are quite different. And you mentioned China and South Korea. I would like to take South Korea as one example. They have a population of about only 50 million. And in the past decade, they have recovered in their economy, and also they have built a lot of contents. I believe that South Korea has a very clear KPI. Another point is the color of the pop culture in which Korea is trying to export. For example, dance. And the contents of Korean dance is great. The music videos, they are very colorful, and you would be able to know just by looking at the screen that this is a Korean group. It's very unique. So it is very well planned out, whatever group it is. So nothing is coincidental. Everything is planned. South Korea is utilizing ICT very well in that sense. The second point It's been 12 years since I have come back to Thailand. And in the past 12 years, I have received some consultation about showing TV programs which were created in Japan and showing it in Thailand. So reselling of the contents in countries outside of Japan. So those contents were created for Japan. So it did not have the assumption of globalization. So for Generation X and Generation Y, there was a big hit of a TV program called TV Champion. And in order to be impactful from the globalization perspective, you should promote the Japanese culture first and create fans first. And that would be critical to be impactful in this world of globalization. In South Korea, KPI is very clear. And also, rather than selling the contents, you have to think about giving. So Japan should give more, maybe donate even first. So those are my thoughts. The third point, the last point. I talked about the generation gap. So the KPI, the objective is one. You have to give first before selling. And what would be generated from the generation gap? So there will be a big economic impact from it. And I think that this is related to whether Japanese products will sell in the future abroad. For example, the Japan drama series, it used to be aired in Thailand. But just because the Japanese TV series are aired, the cup noodles would not sell well. But when the South Korean drama series are shown on Thai TV, the instant noodles from South Korea sells very well off the shelves. So on Netflix, there are a Japanese drama series, and maybe there should be a situation created where when those TV programs are aired, Japanese cars would sell better in those countries which those series were seen. There needs to be a master plan. So there needs to be a multiplication between culture and economy. So the auto manufacturer, the home appliances manufacturers from Japan, IT companies from Japan. Those companies should be thinking about how to create the contents that could be globalized. Those are my thoughts. Thank you very much.
And Professor Kitty, have you had anything to add for this point?
I would like to move on.
Yes, so Professor Kitty will be talking about the challenges and potentialities of Japan-Asia cultural exchange. So considering the appropriate distance between culture and politics, please comment on that, please.
I think Professor Okawa has pointed out a very important issues on the culture and politics, and he rightly put it as the increasing sentiment of people and the government to see the effect more in the short term and in more numerical evaluable assessment, which is not quite a good sign for cultural diplomacy, because culture is a long-term enterprise. It's a long-term. You need to invest. You need to make effort long-term in order to to get the culture ingrained into other country people sentiment. And I think Japan has been very successful on that. Because Japan did not lump together the propaganda and culture together. So Japan has separated culture and PR, information, propaganda issues. So I think that is the strength of Japan. Japan should keep that strength. And that's the first point. The second point is that cultural diplomacy should be a constant policy of a country like Japan to carry goodwill to other countries. So that should not be subject to budget reduction often. If that does not show effect in short term and then just cut the budget, I think that's not the right way to go. Because cultural affection, they need long-term evaluation. It needs time. And the third point is that nationalism should not be presented in cultural diplomacy. That would be the weak point of cultural diplomacy if nationalism has been incorporated. So in case of territorial problem, that should not be included in cultural diplomacy whatsoever. That would tarnish the reputation of a country that doing so. I think the reason why Chinese pop culture is not that popular until recently, that Chinese pop culture tend to be less favored by Asian spectators because they emphasize a lot on nationalism. A lot of movie against Japan, in fact. Many nationalist movie that does not cater to the preference of other Asian countries. That's why Chinese movie has not become much a big hit in Asia compared to Korean movie or in the past Hong Kong movie or some Japanese movie, but very few that become a big hit yet. So I think nationalism should be avoided from cultural diplomacy whatsoever. Thank you.
Okay, and during the Professor Ogawa's speech also, he raised many issues, for example, the declining birth rate and aging society, multiculturalism, global environmental problems, disaster prevention and recovery. And what about if we think how to collaborate and foster the equal partnership between Japan and Thailand and other Asian countries? Maybe we could ask Mr. Kandathon first to comment and then Professor Kitty.
Thank you very much for the question. I would very much like to hear Professor Ogawa's comments as well, but let me comment on the question. The word SDGs has appeared in the past few years, and now everybody in Japan is talking about it, and some Thai companies, 25 Thai companies has also been included on the SDG index. So many companies are much more aware of the environmental issues these days. And globalization includes different trends like aging society and environmental destruction. I don't think humanity had a common purpose in the past. For example, supporting countries suffering from poverty, or rich people or assisting poor people. Those movements have existed for a long time. But tackling SDGs with the effort of all the countries together, this is, I think, new. And when it comes to culture and diplomacy, I use the word KPI. The country is KPI. This will be aligned to these kind of a global KPI. And on a global level, humanity's common problems needs to be a part of the alignment of each country's KPI. So these are common challenges between Thailand and Japan, as well as the common challenge for countries across the world. And in that sense, contents from Japan should have awareness of these kind of global concerns, and this will invite the empathy of many people and increase fans for Japanese culture. So let me give one example of a company. Honda is a Japanese automotive OEM, and it has developed a system of tracking car-to-car technology. And people who have difficulty seeing can actually use this technology. You put the sensor in the shoe, and as the person is moving around, they can utilize this technology. So this is a kind of a contribution to the society by an automotive OEM, although this does not relate to automobiles. And this kind of contribution can be very helpful in developing new culture. And this will, I believe, contribute to raising Japan's presence in the world.
Professor Gitti, please.
I agree with Okawa Sensei that there are many common issues between Japan and Southeast Asia and particularly Thailand. I think I appreciate Japan Foundation that it tends to take culture in a broad definition. It's not only traditional culture, pop culture, material culture, but they work on some abstract issues in terms of societal culture or culture in society, practice in society. In the case of disaster management, disaster mindset and training the youth, and for example, engagement with Muslim youth. I think that is a very good initiative of the Japan Foundation. So I think Japan Foundation should continue to engage with Southeast Asia and Thailand in terms of broad cultural interactions. And particularly in Thailand and Southeast Asian country, we have undergone social transformation tremendously. In terms of middle class, like Okawa Sensei had pointed out, middle class has been increasing. So we see new culture, new consumption. And we also see some social issues, social problems that come with modern society. The youth, juvenile problem, juvenile delinquent. And recently, aging society. Aging society has been the issues in Singapore, in Thailand, and for many countries in Southeast Asia. I think Japan is the front runner in Asia that counter this kind of problem. So we should be able to learn the good lessons, practices from Japan, and also some mistakes that Japan had made. I think that can be good contributions. And not only aging society, in terms of rural development, rural depopulation, I think that is the big problem in Japan, and it become increasing problem in Thailand as well. How to bring up the locality, to develop locality, that would be the good thing that Japan and Thailand can share experiences. Consumer, the pattern of consumption that Thailand can also learn from Japan, and also other Southeast Asian countries can learn from Japan as well. So there are many things that we can work together, and I'm glad that Japan Foundation and Japan itself tend to be aware of that and does not take culture as only material culture, but more in a broader term, culture in society. Thank you.
What a very stimulating talk and discussion we have today. As I also study in Japan, and my research was based on transnational cultural identity. So now listening to all the comments today, I think that Japan has maybe it's time to revise, the policy in terms of, maybe should focus just like Mr. Ganathon said and have the strategy as well, right? And I would like to add in terms of media, because I'm in the field of media and social media, that plays significant roles in terms of, exchanging and also transforming and educating the generation so that we can bridge the generational gaps and also bring, the world, Japan and Thailand and also other Asian countries close together, because I believe that Japan has very good intentions. All right, so now let's hear from Professor Ogawa after all the comments that we have. Please, Professor.
コメントいただきたいと思います。Thank you. Thank you very much. Professor Kitty and Mr. Gantaton has touched upon many, many topics. And I myself have been stimulated and inspired from their talks. I do not think I'll be able to address everything that was discussed, but I would like to pick up on some of the ideas or topics that have left a strong impression on me. First of all, in terms of what Professor Kitty mentioned, globalization has shrunk the role of governments, but actually a government continues to play an important role. And this is something that I completely agree with. For example, cultural exchange as part of public policy. There are areas that cannot be done by the private market, and the governments or local governments or public institutions still play a role in cultural exchange. For example, protecting cultural diversity and protecting the culture of minorities or local regional cultures. This cannot be protected or promoted on a kind of a market-based principle. And this is where governments can play an important role. And to rejuvenate these local cultures or minority cultures through international exchange is where our governments can play a role. Also, realizing social justice is another role of the governments. Leaving everything to the market may enlarge the gap between rich and poor, or children who are born in low-income households may not be given the same opportunities, and this is something that needs to be corrected by the government.
Through scholarships that may be able to help the children who are not able to study abroad because of the low income that their family earns. So in that sense, the state actors still have a role to play. So how we would be able to map out the role in which the state actors and the private actors could play in this field must be thought through. Mr. Gantatorn mentioned culture and economy. And I think there was a discussion of what each country would want out of the Japanese culture. So I would like to be critical. In Cool Japan strategy, what Japan needs to think about is as follows. If we say Southeast Asia, there are many countries. There are a diversity of needs there. And also, if we look at the people within Thailand, the people who are living in the northeastern part of Thailand may be different from those people who are living in Bangkok. So we need to be aware of those differences. Also, the cool Japan strategy, that coolness must be felt by the non-Japanese people, not by the Japanese people who are providing it. Just because Japanese people think it's cool, it doesn't necessarily mean that the people of other countries would consider it cool. So there needs to be a very careful consideration made to the communication made in the cool Japan strategy in which the Japanese government is taking. Also, both gentlemen have mentioned about the cultural diplomacy in which South Korea and China are conducting. And the content of South Korea is now spreading all around the world. I myself don't believe that they are competitors because culture is not a zero-sum game. In that sense, the fact that South Korean culture is popular around the world means that the Western countries who were not interested in Asian culture before, South Korea have provided a gateway to Asian culture. So we can work together with South Korea in spreading Asian culture. We may be competitors, but there are areas where we can collaborate. And there are many areas like that. Also, the contents of South Korea is full of takeaways. Japan can learn a lot from it. At the same time, the reason why South Korean pop culture is so popular is because of the democratization and globalization. At the end of 1980s, South Korea was democratized, and under the military rule, there were South Koreans who had moved away from South Korea and emigrated to the United States, for example, but they have come back and they have brought home the management system of the US, for example. And this was brought about by the new generation, the younger generation who knows democracy. So the change in the generation and the democratization had played an important role in the strength of South Korea. And in the 1970s to 80s in Japan, the pop culture of Japan, as well as the Japanese pop music, had impacted the K-pop music. The effect is mutual in culture, and the change in the generation promotes a spread of new culture. And I think that the generation now are learning from each other. For example, the Japanese young generation learning from the Thai culture, for example, and vice versa. Another point, the common agenda between Japan and Asian countries, nurturing of equal partnership. There are some things which are very specific. For example, environmental issues. In the pre-modern tradition of Japan, there are know-hows to protect the environment. For example, there is a phrase that forest is a lover of the sea. Since the Edo period, forests were treasured because those forests had nurtured the sea, those living in the sea. And I think that there are local wisdoms like that in various Southeast Asian countries. So for example, in Indonesia, you would not be cutting down the forest where the spirit of the gods reside. I think that local wisdom is there in Thailand as well. And I think those local wisdom is something that we can learn from to protect the environment. And I think that can be shared amongst the Asian countries, and that would be part of the cultural exchange. I'm sure that there would be issues about religions, and there may be some reflection of the religion when that happens. That's my view. As Professor Kitty has mentioned, culture and politics, there needs to be an appropriate distance between them. In the 1970s, when there was a strong anti-Japan sentiment in Southeast Asia, what Japan tried to do was not unilaterally communicate about Japan to Southeast Asian countries, but rather more proactively learn about Southeast Asian countries. And showing that empathy had led to building of trust towards Japan in Southeast Asian countries. So mutual understanding is critical. So rather than unilaterally communicating nationalism to other countries, there needs to be a mutual understanding amongst the countries. So that will be all for my comment for now. Thank you.
Professor Ogawa, and also before that, we have asked some of the viewers if you have any questions or comments. So now we will go on to the questions that we have. I think there's a few comments to ask now. Okay, the first question is, what is your assessment of the Trilateral Cooperation Secretariat or the Sankoku Kyoryoku Jimukyoku from the perspective of cultural collaboration? Professor Kitty, Mr. Kanaton, or Professor Ogawa, if you'd like to answer that, please.
I guess
Yes?
そうだと思います。Japan-South Korea-China summit has not been held. The situation has been quite difficult. And I don't believe that this problem will go away anytime soon. But personally, tourism or the exchanges of the civilians must be promoted amongst those three countries. So I talked about the Japan-China Exchange Center. There needs to be a promotion of the exchange amongst the youth. That would be critical. Regrettably, due to COVID, the tourism itself has stopped, and this is a serious problem. When the COVID recedes, there needs to be a strengthening of exchange of the youth. And through that, there should be a nurturing of the relationship of trust among the three countries. Thank you.
Professor Kitty, please.
So on this question, I think we should not look at the Secretariat Office for the role of cultural diplomacy. But I think Japan has been continually making efforts in promoting cultural exchange with both Korea and China. In fact, in the presentation of Professor Ogawa, he also mentioned about the friendship year between Japan and Korea in 2002 when they co-organized the World Cup Soccer Championship. And in 2006, Japan also established Japan-China Exchange Center. So I think that has been the a kind of constant efforts being made from Japan in engaging with with Korea and China. rather than secretariat is more on organizing a meeting, summit between the leaders or minister among the three countries.
その事務的な窓口でありますので、
Comments? Yes.
コメントありますか？
二人の専門的なコメントからちょっと離れるかもしれません。
So I will be going from the experts' comments that we have received already. So there were some things that I felt as living in Japan as a non-Japanese. On the train, there are priority seats. And that got me wondering a lot. The reason why the priority seats for the senior citizens are, this means that people are not so mindful about the senior citizens. And also, I receive a lot of questions from the Japanese people about what is the rate of the workers, female workers, and no other country's citizens ask me that. Also, the issue about the visit of the politicians to Yasukuni Shrine. And there are a lot of East Asia specific things. Myanmar and Thailand, Cambodia and Laos, there were a lot of wars. Some battles have been lost, some has been won, and many people have interacted and equal partnership. So when there is an equal partnership, when the equal partnership is mentioned, this means that the assumption is that there is a disparity. So in that sense, Thailand does not use the term equal partnership because being equal is common sense. So that's the Thai perspective. And from a Thai eye, I would like to be optimistic. At this moment, we should not be thinking about those, we should not be nitpicking about those.
Very much. Yes. So the next question, because we have, I think, a few more. What is today's relevance of Pan-Asianism or Asia Chugi, right? From the perspective of Japan Foundation, although it has emerged within a very different historical context, would there be any ideas that are still inspiring in our today's world?
Well, Asianism is not a philosophy of Japan Foundation, I believe. For the Japan Foundation, of course, the Asian countries are very important, the very important region, and we have extremely important friends in Asia. That is one thing. And also, as mentioned earlier, Japan Foundation's policy is to promote bilateral relations like Japan and Thailand or Japan and Indonesia, as well as to promote mutual understanding amongst the various Asian countries to create a sense of community in the mid to long term. That, I believe, is the philosophy of Japan Foundation. But we don't call this Asianism. At least I don't think so, because it indicates a very political sentiment. Also, this harkens back to the kind of the policy of pre-war Japan, that Japan wanted to create Asia with Japan at the center. So this has a very negative implication as well as creating a kind of harmonious circle of Asian countries with Japan at the center. And I don't think that Japan Foundation has ever used the word Asianism, or it ever will in the future.
I think probably the people who ask question may think about the concept of East Asian community, which has been discussed during the 2000s at the end of Koizumi administration, 2005, 2006, 2007. A lot of books in Japan has been released on East Asian community, because at that time the regionalization and regionalism in East Asia was the key issue, and many countries paying attention. We organized ASEAN Plus 3 meeting, we organized East Asia Summit, starting with ASEAN Plus 6 and then ASEAN Plus 8 with US and Russia. ASEAN Plus 3 mean plus China, Japan, Korea. Yep. So I think that is the momentum to think about East Asian community and so on. But we have seen that the debate has been diminished because the increasing rivalry between Japan and China in 2000, but now in 2010, rivalry between China and the United States. So it seemed that community building had given way to realism, to realist power competition in the regions. So, but anyhow, I agree with Okawa Sensei that Japan Foundation has not had that kind of idea on Pan-Asianism. Of course, at the height of the debate of East Asian community, Japan Foundation may advance some program in Southeast Asian country and also in in Korea and in China. That is natural because we have a high degree of interdependence. So promotion of cultural exchange with this country is come as natural as well. I think it's normal. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. And we move to the next question. That is for the Professor Ogawa. Would you be able to mention cultural order vs Mukokuseki of the Japanese cultural products export? What is your thoughts on that?
ということに関してはどのようにお考えですか？ So mukokuseki without nationality. So rather than exporting it without nationality, I think it would be more about the receiver receiving it without the Japanese nationality attached to it. So there was a Japan studies researcher in the United States, and the people who love Japanese manga is not reading it just because they like Japanese culture, but rather they like manga. So it was without the Japanese nationality attached to Japanese mangas. And if that's accepted around the world, and I believe that it can be without the Japanese nationality, it doesn't necessarily have to be affiliated with the Japanese nationality, because if government does something to promote that, this will be an inappropriate closeness between culture and the politicians. And of course, the manga artists, if they want to add on Japanese color to their work, that's no problem, of course. And the receivers wanting something Japanese, that's great. But the cultural promotion bodies should not be thinking from a Japanese nationality affiliation perspective.
Thank you very much. Yes, so we move on to the next question. How can Japan materialize cultural diplomacy policy?
実現していくことができると思いますか？ Well, this is something that is of great concern to me these days. In the 2010s, Japanese cultural diplomacy was focused on Tokyo Olympic. So 2020, which was postponed to 2021. So during the past decade, the vision was that because of the Olympics, more and more people will be coming to Japan and experience Japanese culture. Or because of the Olympics, this can be an opportunity to promote Japanese culture overseas. So the Tokyo Olympics was seen as a kind of the important mid or long-term goal. And this was modeled on the UK's London Olympics. Olympics is not just a celebration of sports, but also an opportunity to enrich cultural infrastructure and cultural programs. And this was successful in the UK. So Japan also envisioned that we can leverage our strength in pop culture and so on to enrich Japan's culture. And this had been the long-term vision. But now the Olympics are over. So what next? I myself am at a loss as well. The current Kishida administration of Japan, what is the cultural diplomacy strategy of the new administration, or what is the cultural policy of the new government? Is there going to be a clear message or not? I'm very interested, and I think that the government should provide a clear master plan in terms of its cultural policy going forward. And this should be communicated and disseminated in Japan and outside. And I think the key here is going to be the various common challenges across the world. So global warming, environmental deterioration, and the friction between modernization and tradition. These are various challenges faced by community, and Japan should partake in that in terms of its culture. And secondly, it is always the young people who create new culture and exchange. So how to create such younger generation who are going to promote culture? So what is going to be the policy of the Japanese government? I'm very keen to also gain a better understanding.
This same question goes also to Professor Gitti and Mr. Kantathon. Yes.
Thank you. So there was a discussion about removing the nationality from culture. So I would like to touch upon that as well. So what will be the cultural diplomacy policy of Japan? Professor Ogawa touched upon the Olympics as one past goal. But my view, my personal view, is I think that cultural diplomacy can be conducted every single day. For example, traditional culture like kimono or drinking tea with a traditional tea ceremony is not something that we do every day. But for example, you can listen to music every day, or you can watch movies or drama every day. And if it's not removing the traditional aspect, Thai people often go every weekend to Uniqlo and just stroll around. And Thai people also go to Mujirushi as well. And so whether or not they purchase anything, they love to just stroll around and experience. So life wear is a Uniqlo's concept, and Mujirushi as well. It's a very Japanese style concept. Although they don't promote this as a Japanese. So I myself think that these are, although this is a Japanese company's product, it does not necessarily have to appeal its Japaneseness. So going back to what I mentioned, I think that Japanese government can also help these companies. Maybe can promote these kind of maybe a new initiative by Uniqlo or Mujirushi with some kind of a master plan. And if there is a collaboration between the private sector and the government, I think it is perfectly possible to promote culture every single day.
I think for this question, how can Japan materialize cultural diplomacy? I think there are already two directions that Japan has been pursuing. First, as I said earlier, Japan take culture in a broader sense, not only material culture, but also societal culture, practices, and social issue, environmental issue that Okawa Sensei also mentioned. So I think taking culture in a broader sense is a good way to pursue cultural diplomacy. And the second direction that I have seen Japan been pursuing is the taking culture as more global culture, not only Japan. This is Japan, it's from Japan. But Japan tend to view culture as the culture of the youth, global culture, how to manage disaster, how to deal with disaster. For example, how to take care of environment. That is a kind of global culture that Japan has been nurturing. I think that is the good direction to go on.
If we maybe look further, but the question would be like, how does Japan's view promotion of cultural diplomacy in other parts of Asia beyond East and Southeast Asia? Please, Professor Ogawa first, and then if our commentators here have anything to say.
The first Asia Center, which was created in 1995 by Japan Foundation. So there was a theatrical play called React, which was created, and many artists from across Asia had been gathered. And what they have created together was their version of King Lear. And this was a very excellent art. And that had gone beyond the Asian framework, and it was evaluated very highly around the world. King Lear was shown not only in Asia, but also in Europe. I think that the production company went to Paris to show their version of King Lear. So the result of the cultural exchange, which there are things which could be brought to various Asian countries in the same format. And the second Asia Center conducted dance project. This was a street dance project. The street dancers from Japan and Southeast Asia had created a piece of street dancing. And this has a universal appeal. And that dance performance was given in the United States, where hip-hop dancing is very popular. So the collaboration in the field of art could be shared around the world, and I think that's one possibility.
Let me think about one thing. It seems that economic interdependence seems to be the condition that cultural diplomacy can flourish. If we do not have economic interdependence, it seems cultural diplomacy can be a little bit more difficult. For example, in Thailand, because many Japanese investment, so Thai people came to learn Japanese language, for example. That is a good starting point to encounter more deeper culture. So I just think about in Middle East, for example, or in Central Asia, it may be difficult for a country like Japan to promote its culture unless you have more interdependence or more proximity. That seems to be influential in cultural diplomacy as well.
考えています。
Have anything to add, please?
はい。
Well, I have been talking from the culture and the economy perspective. And product out, market in are the terms which are being used in marketing a lot these days. And it's the same in the world of culture. And there are people who feel affinity to Japan because they have been learning Japanese. But not just this affinity, but I think that we should think more about how we can benefit each other. So for example, in my generation, when we learned Japanese, we were able to earn more. Of course, the situation is different now, but by grasping how learning certain countries' culture will be beneficial for their life, I think that can promote the learning of the culture more.
And we have the comments, which is something said that new PD is closely related to the para-diplomacy theory. Perhaps the Japan Foundation can expand its collaboration with cities, both domestic and international, to foster cultural interchange. So now we're coming towards the end. We have, I think, 15 minutes left. So thank you very much indeed for all speakers today, Professor Dr. Ogawa, Professor Dr. Gitti, and Mr. Kantathorn. It has been very stimulating and inspiring and very much comprehensively and enlightening as well at the same time to many concepts and also a lot of emerging issues and also practices, how to promote and planning for future cultural exchanges activities and strengthening collaborations among public institutes and private sectors. Before we end our symposium today, may I invite our three speakers to give the final words, please. Professor Ogawa first.
Thank you very much. New public diplomacy is one comment that I received at the end. So I would like to mention one point from Japan Foundation. And one is a project. And Kantathorn-san mentioned earlier that people start to learn Japanese because it's fun. And there's a project called Nihongo Partners, Japanese Language Partners. And various people from Japan, from different generations, visit Southeast Asian cities and villages and support the language learning. So many of them have that they talk to have never visited Japan but are learning Japanese. And if the volunteers can introduce various aspects of Japanese culture as well. So it's actually a very popular project and makes it fun to learn Japanese. And this is not just geared toward increasing the people who learn Japanese, but actually these partners go to Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, and they come back loving that country. And then they can promote the Thailand or Southeast Asian culture in Japan to Japanese people, whether it's the food or the culture, and creates fans of Thai culture or Indonesian culture in Japan. So this is a kind of the foundation for cultural exchange. And we're trying to involve not just professionals, but young people and non-professionals to expand the circle of cultural exchange and connecting the Southeast Asian countries more to Japan. And this is something that we should continue to focus on and strengthen, I believe.
Thank you very much.
I have 2 points to as my final words. First, I think going back to the title of this symposium, the role of public institute and cultural exchange. So, public institute here, I mean Japan Foundation, it also represent the key public institute in Japan that pursue cultural exchange. So my 2 points is this. First, I think this time is a challenging time for a public institute like Japan Foundation, because now cultural exchange, cultural enterprise has a changing landscape in terms of globalization, in terms of ICT technology, new platform, in terms of more Asian cultural powerhouse came to the stage. However, the second point is that I think Japan and Japan Foundation has been doing well in many things, like I have said, on cultural, taking culture in a broader sense, for example, and try to have conversation between cultures, not only one way. Japan has been aware of this very, very well ahead of any nations. That's why Japan has emphasized the term cultural exchange all the time. Japan has been aware of the two-way exchange is important, and that is Japan has been doing quite well. But in this situation, in this changing landscape, what Japan Foundation can do more to facilitate cultural exchange between Japan, Southeast Asia, and also beyond. That is the key issues. And I think Japan Foundation had some guiding principle already, have some concept already that culture cannot be only Japan, cannot be nationalistic culture. Culture should be a more global culture that can be shared among people all over the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Kantatorn, please.
ないと考えます。
Thank you very much. It is a great privilege and a pleasure for me to participate in today's symposium. So as final words, Professor Ogawa introduced further activities by Japan Foundation, and I very much agree with what Professor Kitty said. I believe that the role of Japan Foundation is something that we can expand even more. And when we talk about Thai's society, going back to the focused selection of Japanese culture, I think rather than strengthening the weaker part of Japanese culture, Japan should focus on strengthening the very strong parts of Japanese culture. And the Japan Foundation can play a role in accelerating the promotion of Japanese culture. And I hope that more and more our Thai people can appreciate the culture of Japan, in spite of the stronger presence of other Asian countries. And so I hope that the Japan Foundation can continue to play a very... Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so our online audience, let me remind you, so please fill out questionnaires that we posted on the YouTube while you watch from the live streaming today. And also you may watch in English or Japanese, because we have simultaneous interpreters later. And we also wish you to have a very good New Year 2022. And for the future program, we will be posting information later. And I would like to thank our 3 panelists today. Thank you, Professor Dr. Ogawa Tadashi, Professor at the Faculty of Letters of Tomi University. Thank you very much, Professor Dr. Gitti Prasad Suk, Professor at the Faculty of Political Science, from Thammasat University. And also from the private sector, thank you very much, Mr. Kantathorn Wannavasu, Representative Director of Mediator Company Limited. And here you're watching us live from Japan Foundation here at Bangkok office. And we hope that you enjoy our program today that Japan Foundation has trying to launch the International Public Symposium. This is Culture and Diplomacy #2, reviewing role of public institutes and cultural exchanges. If you have any comments, please do not hesitate to contact us. We have the online channels that you can also watch in YouTube, and we have also in Facebook. Now, I'm Rungtip Chonnapalai. Thank you very much for watching us. Thank you very much. สวัสดีค่ะ สวัสดีค่ะ